Greetings. Today's talk focuses on the fact that there's a concept called supply chain addiction. So once Tesla has gotten a taste of the supply chain capabilities of China and its Shanghai factory, this has ended the German Gigafactory dreams of Tesla inadvertently, and we'll explain that as part of our show and why. We'll also do our usual roundup of interesting things happening with Tesla this week and EVs, and then finally our health tips as usual. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time on our channel, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. We look forward to your making comments during our show, but we usually respond at the end in order to avoid impacting those that watch the show afterwards. And also wanted to shout out to our subscribers. Only half the folks watching our show are subscribers, and we'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe and then unsubscribe if you don't like what we do, but it really helps the channel to move forward if you do subscribe. And then our Patreon supporters, goes without saying, we appreciate your support. And if you can support us on the Patreon space, there is information on the page to do so. We'd appreciate that support. So we've had a series going on China and Tesla opening there and its impact on the company. There was a bit of data that came out from Elon Musk that indicated that when you look at every element of supply, the new Gigafactory in Shanghai, China, was 50% of the cost structure that was being experienced by Tesla in the United States and in other places. So we were a bit surprised by this and perplexed as to, is this possible? Why is it possible? How does it work, etc.? And if it's possible, it's definitely a path to profitability for Tesla that we think is pretty awesome. So there's some background information here. Number one, the first item that you should be aware of is that China is the #1 producer of aluminum in the world. Now, if you think about it, the external panels, there are a whole bunch of elements of Tesla's vehicle or vehicles that are aluminum focused because it's lighter weight than steel. And so both for the steel elements and the aluminum elements, Tesla can source those in China. And because those are subsidized industries by the Chinese government, we can now see why the cost of aluminum might be lower. Elon pointed out that batteries would not only be coming from the Gigafactory, but also there would be a way in which batteries would be supplied via Japan as well as China. And what's interesting is that the aluminum being used by China has come from, I believe, Nippon Heavy Industries in Japan. And as this plant in China opens and the Chinese have such low-cost aluminum, we're expecting to see Tesla work to keep the battery production secrets of Panasonic out of the country, but take advantage of the discounted cost of aluminum. So we think it's going to be interesting to see where both, stamping and car parts will definitely stay in China, but when it comes to the aluminum used on the batteries, we expect for China to ship large quantities of aluminum to Panasonic in Japan to produce the batteries that would go into the new Model 3s there. Another element of cost that we were amazed by, is the fact that if you look at the information about the new Tesla plant in Shanghai, China, it also includes dorms for workers. Now, we don't know how many units of dorms that means, but one of the comments made by our viewers in our previous show was the fact that you potentially have prison labor going into the process of the Tesla production in China. And I wouldn't agree 100% that it's necessarily prisoners, but there was some video of similar dorms that produce iPhone products that showed that it might as well have been a prison based on the living conditions of the workers. I thought this was interesting because if you're offering housing along with a decent job, the likelihood of workers being late, the ability to potentially do extra shifts when needed, etc., isn't hampered by the degree to which traffic or, finding housing or other issues might impact whether or not those workers are available and can contribute. So the bottom line is that we could definitely see why the worker component of cost might be 50% of what Tesla experiences in Silicon Valley or in other places that it has to source workers. But let's add in this extra layer of the fact that they're providing housing, which sort of introduces that whole concept of the prison labor situation, but it allows those folks to be there. So what we're doing right now is kind of walking through the major elements of cost to determine how is it that Tesla could really, / Elon, discuss their cost inputs being 50% of what's being experienced, for example, in the United States. So what's fascinating to me then is the fact that your biggest cost in terms of the car is the aluminum that's going into both batteries and cars. China has cost advantages related to them being the largest producer in the world, and then even the elements of the batteries, cobalt and some of the other elements there, lithium, China has some of the sort of largest resources in the world going on there as well. So it starts to add up that as Tesla enters China, there are all these different ways in which their costs are a lot lower. And if you'll think about it, we were discussing the fact that China wants Tesla to develop supply chain addiction, where your costs are so much lower in that space that you really can't afford to go elsewhere. You get addicted to the structure and cost structure that China offers you that others don't. And so one other element of the whole discussion of how, why China, Tesla, etc., is that we just had a meeting with a gentleman who's an instructor who taught in both Beijing, another city, and in Shanghai. And he ran through a few interesting data points that we thought were pretty fascinating. Number one is that in the space of there's a state in the United States called Delaware, and inside of that space, he explained, China has 165 million people that live in greater Shanghai. So that's evidently, within 100 miles, 200 miles of Shanghai. They have 165 million people. What he also explained is what people in America don't realize is that China has a middle class as wealthy as those in America. That's about 300 million people deep. And those are the folks who are really Tesla's customers, even though it may not seem offhand that that's the case. He also indicated that there's a way in which the middle class that's wealthy in China exerts pressure, but it's not, in your face type of pressure against the government. What they actually are doing is they're saying to the government that we'd like to see movement on this issue, but they also are doing it in a way that's sort of very low key, that won't promote, major issues. So what's fascinating to me further is the fact that he indicated that this population of people, if you look at the trends on cancer in China, it's severely up. So people are wearing face masks, etc. And so it's really fascinating to watch as people engage. So it's fascinating to watch China is engaging Tesla to build this factory. But once we have these cost inputs drop like they are, if the vehicles are priced like they are in the United States, we're seeing a $49,000 vehicle that now has a 50% profit margin built in. And this is where we see optimism about where Tesla's going. So Tesla has obviously multiple choices. They can have, a $49,000 or $45,000 price on that vehicle, even though they have a 50% margin, or they could afford to cut the price into the late 20s, early 30s, cut the margin down, but dominate in terms of market share in the space. And it looks like the early signs are Tesla's going to keep the price reasonably high, which we believe gives a lot of capital to flow into covering some of the large amounts of debts that Tesla has around the world. So I know you're asking the question, why is it that the Gigafactory dream in Germany or other parts of Europe is dead. And the reason for that is that when you look at the labor laws of Germany, there are no factories in Germany where you have workers living in dorms within the factory domicile. The whole structure of China in terms of how it gets things done is completely different. And so basically, Tesla's going to have a decision to make. Do we want to build a European factory and have it be 50% more expensive or very close to break even? Or do we want to simply build another China factory and enjoy the huge margins that come with the lower input costs that we just discussed? So I'm kind of fascinated by these developments. And as you know, we do things a little bit differently, but I just want to mention one more data point we got from our Chinese sort of instructor. And that is that he was living in Shanghai, and the pollution is so bad that he was getting sick a lot. So he decided to take a 9-day holiday to Indonesia to just get fresh air and relax for 9 days. When he came back, there was a new row of apartments that was blocking his apartment, and he couldn't actually find where he lived. So not only had they built new apartments, but people had already moved into those apartments within the 9-day period that he was gone. I specifically wanted to bring this up because there's all this stuff that's suggesting Tesla's factory is delayed till the end of the year in production. But this is why we think that production is going to start happening in September, maybe on a test basis, but late September, early October, that plant's going to start producing cars. And that 3,000 per day number, I think, is way low, given how focused and serious the Chinese are about the delta or change that they want to see happen when it comes to pollution. So I bring all this up because it contextualizes better, I think, well, what's going on in China and why, how is it going to impact the rest of the company? And when you're talking 50% margins that go with the lower costs, I think it's pretty amazing. We think that the supply chain addiction process that we've learned about and have been discussing is going to actually really kick in as the plant opens, but especially if the government likes early returns and decides to open up another factory elsewhere in the country of a similar nature. And now you have multiple factories starting to open with very low cost basis. And so now you can see why we don't think Tesla will build in Europe, especially Germany. There's a nice space right next to Grohmann Engineering. There are a number of reasons why the European plant hasn't gone in, especially in Germany, where it really is the best place for it to go. And the main reason is the labor unions / auto companies are very tightly wound, and there's an aggressive effort right now to protect that industry from attack by outsiders, because as we all know, every auto job has a 7 multiplier. So for every person working within those auto companies, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's 1 million people in Germany that are directly tied to the major autos, that's 7 more people whose livelihoods depend on those workers. So when you have potentially 10 million people in that country that are dependent upon jobs related to auto, and you have competitors like Tesla entering, there's a protect our home entities that is a big part of why the factory has not been built. When you look on the other side of costs, be it the labor unions, be it the cost and time of construction, China is breaking records on all of those. So I think if you're a decision maker and you have to evaluate a new plant in Europe or another plant, in 4 or 5 months flat in another part of China, where they're allowing you to become almost a monopoly because your battery technology is so far ahead of domestic manufacturers, then I don't think Tesla will be able to turn down the opportunity of China growth versus shipping that production off into places where the costs would be so much higher, potentially putting them into almost a loss as they build there. And again, as we know, time is money. So if they're going to build a plant in 6 months and have it running, that's sort of the China way of getting business done. And the pressure applied because of how bad the pollution there obviously is a big driver for how this is all working out. So hats off to the Chinese for their aggressiveness with getting quality solutions done that represent a rapid step forward. And hats off to Elon for setting it up such that the company owns 100% of that facility. So we thought this was pretty fascinating, amazing to hear of the small and large elements of how China will deal with Tesla as it enters Shanghai. And I just think that the integrated process by which Tesla is operating represents a very difficult mode for competitors to enter and be successful. We've already covered this numerous times, but there's a fascinating battle going on, which is that, for example, Daimler-Benz made an attempt to build their own battery factory in a place called Chemnitz in Germany, and the factory was a failure. And so the interesting thing that's fascinating about it is that they made the attempt, the battery efforts were a failure, and they decided to instead buy half of SK, a Korean manufacturer of batteries, and those batteries should start hitting the market here in the next year or so. And sort of that brings up another issue that we thought might be a whole show by itself, but we think is really fascinating, which is there's been a carrot and stick process where the governing bodies in Europe have been making an effort to increase the amount of EVs and reduce the sort of carbon footprint of cars. Excuse me. This is why Dieselgate came up, as you know, in the case of VW. But there's a carrot and stick process where they've been asking those big companies to make the transitions, and those companies have been sort of dragging their feet and tried the Dieselgate method as a way to go. What's really fascinating to me is the fact that the stick part of it is that starting next year, there are a large number of companies that produce big polluting SUVs, etc., that have to have EVs in their mix. Otherwise, they start taking financial penalties, potentially in the billions of dollars. So the interesting thing is that there's this sort of fascinating element going on where, in the case of BMW, for example, while they may introduce a series of SUVs next year, what if it doesn't? What if they don't sell? Now you have the problem of you produce these vehicles, they're not selling, and you get the penalty for those unsold vehicles. So what I think the solution is they're going to have to go to is it's cheaper to pool EV credits from Tesla and pay that credit rather than taking a very much larger penalty by not having those vehicles sold and on the road. So we think that this is going to represent a huge windfall for Tesla. The initial round of this is the fact that the folks at Fiat Chrysler have decided that they're not even going to play with it. They're just going to start giving. They're just going to start giving Tesla $1 or $2 billion a year for the next several years until they figure out their EV strategy. And when it comes to Daimler and VW, I think VW actually sells a decent number of electric Golfs, but both Daimler and BMW are going to be hard pressed to get enough vehicles on the road where they either pay the penalty or pay Tesla. So we think that this is a hidden gem of large amounts of cash for Tesla going into the next several years. That's impressive. I also find it interesting, as we've discussed previously, that GM is actually paying Tesla in that $300 to $400 million a year range, because while they're selling Bolts and other EV or hybrid products, they're not selling enough of them that they don't need that offset credit, and therefore they've actually been paying Tesla sort of quietly to actually help them alleviate the burden of these additional costs. And then in terms of interesting cash sidebar notes, as China has brought Tesla in, they still have anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000 incentives to get local consumers to buy EVs. And the earlier Tesla can get, the earlier that Tesla, we just saw a comment, it's painful to feed your enemy by your own flesh. Great comment. I think that's fascinating. You know, what's fascinating, so any rate, one of the incentives for Tesla to be early to the party with SUVs starting in September, or vehicles starting in September, is that the EV payments that go with domestically produced EVs, Tesla could benefit from that, further lowering the price of their vehicles in country. And so therefore, they could end up with a nice run of sales in China driven by lower costs because of being in country and no tariff, and also lower costs because the China subsidies for EV buyers have not been, you know, are still incentivized by the country to do so. So we think this is a very interesting sort of collection of interesting elements. There are some good reasons why Tesla should enter Germany or one of the other European countries to manufacture, but it's hard to see that actually working because bottom line, you know, there's just, you know, it's too profitable to produce in China. And when you bake in things like China's advantages in terms of all these cost elements, even down to the point of rare earth costs, I think it's going to be a devastating factory once it's done and really impact the company greatly. And I think the potential is there for the stock, but it's really going to be interesting to see what they do with that margin. Do they bludgeon competitors in China and elsewhere with it by lowering prices, or they simply keep the prices up and use that profit to reduce debt? It's a big question mark. I think that's hanging over, but those are excellent options to have when it comes to choices by the company. You know, there's some questions about background. I'm a graduate of Stanford University, did some business at Dartmouth. Mostly have been in investment business for a long time. If you've heard of JetBlue, that was one of my deals. I put the CEO together with the funding in Silicon Valley for that. So I've been working kind of in the investment space as well as running small companies for a very long time. And I'm a car fanatic, been doing car shows for about 30 years, test driving, writing, and reviewing. And so I really enjoy learning about the industry, as well as, especially as it's transitioning into new and where it's going. We've seen some comments from you guys saying hello, as well as brief comments on screen. Hopefully others that have been viewing have been able to see those. What I've started doing is sort of copying and pasting those underneath the show afterwards, and we'll probably do this as well. Wanted to further note that don't forget I'm about to do my 20 leg lifts per leg, as well as I'm actually really into drinking ginger tea, so I just finished one. The Chinese version of it is pretty amazing in terms of what they do. Please take time out to, we need your support in terms of, you know, in the lower left, please hit the subscribe button. Also, we could use your help on Patreon if you would. I'm going to close out today with a nice view of this is called the National Harbor in Washington, D.C. area. And there's an amazing sculpture that is here that I think is kind of cool that you guys might enjoy. Thanks once again for joining us. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Tschüss, German, au revoir, French, lehitraot, Hebrew, Choda Hafez, Farsi, Ni hao ma, Chinese, Zdravstvuyte, Russian. I wanted to thank you all for taking time out once again in Jamaica. We say enough respect, walk good. Wanted to say hello to Eric, Donovan, James, the Bronx Pops. All of you, thanks for your comments and thanks for visiting with us. Hey, we like for you guys to prove we're wrong on stuff that we've concluded, that we've added into the show. And we love being wrong in the dialogue. And so feel free to fire away, you know, on constructive criticism on what we cover. Have a great day, and we'll take you out with a nice view. Have a great day. Bye for now, and thank you once again for joining us.